Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our brand new study in Adam Wells, the editor of Phenomenologies of Scripture, published in 2017 by Fordham University Press. It's a series of essays that we're going to take a look at in the theological turn of phenomenology in Europe, especially in France. We're going to begin with the first essay, which is going to be the essay by the editor himself, Adam Wells, and it's going to be a look at biblical criticism and the phenomenology of Scripture. Pages 1 to 20. It's the first essay, but it serves as an introduction to the entire project, which is basically the project to write a phenomenology of Scripture. Let's begin with block 1 with biblical interpretation as phenomenology. And Wells tells us that the current trend of a methodology for interpreting Scripture is scientific. Phenomenology seeks to shift biblical study from science to Scripture and not blindly follow the methodology of naturalism. We posit a concrete engagement with Scripture. Modern biblical criticism follows Spinoza, which means to free the mind from prejudice through an analogy with natural science. However, there's a problem with this giving priority to natural science. In note 2, the resultant scientific desacralization. A true methodology of interpretation should look toward Scripture itself as a source of data, says Wells, and acquire meaning from the study of Scripture itself. Historical criticism is the current dominant mode of interpretation, but at times this method seems to call into question the sacred status of Scripture. Therefore, Wells tells us this scientific desacralization of Scripture must be taken into account. The historical critical method is causing a desacralization of Scripture. So he concludes in note 3, scientific method plus desacralization equals the positing of phenomenology as an authentic method of interpretation. Conflict has emerged between historical critical method and traditional interpretive method. It is affirmed that a new birth of Christianity must be a new birth of consciousness, according to Kuyper. The methodology of naturalism should not be foisted upon Christianity. Therefore, we challenge this notion of the universality of science. Wells tells us that in response to this crisis, Husserl sought to establish phenomenology as an absolute science. So we take a look at note 4, phenomenology as absolute science. Wells tells us that we accept nothing in advance through a free devotion to problems, negating the naturalism attitude of the true, negating that presupposition, returning to things in themselves, from practical connection to things in themselves. So this approach from phenomenology, we'll take a look at note 5. We ask, what kind of science is appropriate to Scripture? We must allow Scripture to give itself freely, examining Scripture within its 4 contexts: the historical, the theological, the social, and the literary. By including this order of context, biblical criticism becomes actually more complex, says Wells. So in conclusion, in block 1, if you take a look at note 6, the order of context and the complexity of interpretation. Scripture must be allowed to give itself fully, without a priori restriction. Through a true hermeneutical engagement, grasping Scripture as phenomena in their complexity. We begin by following Husserl and his principle of principles that every presented intuition is a source of cognition. Every presented intuition is a source of cognition. So in Block 1 we get from Wells the positive theoretical approach that a scientific approach to interpreting Scripture must be phenomenology. Natural science must be bracketed. We must not take up that assumption of the prioritizing of naturalism. Instead, phenomenology seems to be the best approach, says Wells, and he wants to follow the model set by Husserl. There are three major players in phenomenology, not just Husserl. It's actually Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. And personally, I think Hegel gets shortchanged frequently. You hear a lot about Husserl and Heidegger, but very little about Hegel, because Hegel was so dense and so abstract that he gets left out of the conversation many times. He does in this first essay, because we hear about Husserl, we hear about Heidegger, we don't hear about Hegel. But anyway, the posited theory is to take up this theological turn in continental theology and philosophy of approaching Scripture from the point of view of phenomenology, from the perspective of phenomenology. Now we need to look at the concrete aspect of this theory by looking at the aim, the concrete aim of phenomenology as a methodology in Block 2. What does this mean? In Note 1, Block 2, Note 1, we have to consider modality. Every originary presentative intuition is a source of cognition. It is presented as being, remaining open to any manifested phenomena in all of their modalities, and that means we consider imagination, temporality, and memory. To take up this science as a science without presuppositions. Next, Note 2, we take up bracketing. We are to bracket presuppositions during our initial interpretation. For example, assumptions of naturalism should be bracketed, because the dialectic between subject and object is not as clear-cut as naturalism presupposes. Objects are constituted as particular objects by experiencing subjects. So this bracketing is called reduction, says Husserl and says Wells. So he concludes in Block 2, Note 3, modality and bracketing equal phenomenological reduction, consisting of two moments: epoche, which is the setting aside of any thesis of reality, and reduction, the bracketing of the residue left after epoche. The object world is dependent on consciousness, and consciousness interacts with the world in a thetic manner by observing regularities and forming a thesis. Naturalism is the fundamental thesis of the modern world, and that must be bracketed and set aside. Naturalism must be bracketed and set aside. So we need to take a look at this epoche and reduction in Note 4. Reduction explores the residue left over after the step of epoche, pointing to the consciousness of the subject that constitutes phenomenal objects. We look back to the constitutive origin of phenomena. Objectivity of any phenomena is bestowed by consciousness through the historical process of generation. Through the historical process of generation. And so let's take a look at this process in Note 5, Block 2, Note 5, historical process of generation as constituting the real. Wells tells us the more general the theory, the more objective it becomes, and by that he means the more generally accepted the theory, the more objective it becomes. It's mediated through written text, an attempt to reach universality, attempting to reach universal acceptance. We must trace phenomena back to their origin, out of their synthesis into some posited theory, by examining the transcendental conditions of possibility. What are the transcendental possibilities of these phenomena? So if you look at Note 6, transcendental conditions of possibility, which should be, for example, something like the need to measure. This reduction leads back to various options. Not everyone has drawn the same conclusion. We could go with Heidegger's Dasein, possibility for human existence, Finck's Maionic absolute as a creative depiction, or Marianne's givenness, or Romano's event. They all reflect the transcendental status of consciousness. Husserl states that the origin of phenomena takes place in the transcendental depth of consciousness, which creates the possibility for real objectivity. So it's this work of consciousness, the deeper work of consciousness, the transcendental depth of consciousness, which creates possibility of positing the objectivity of the real. That is a key point here. So we're going to have a preference, says Wells, for Husserl's transcendental consciousness in Note 8. It does not seem to support the idea of a consciousness that is produced. However, Scripture may be a possible bridge. It is textual phenomena, and it can be reduced to original life-world context, and it has a transcendental function. Therefore, we can look at Scripture's transcendental function in Note 9. It does create the possibility for world constitutive activity. It is both the result of transcendental process and it is the origin of phenomenal world. It is the result of historical process and a source for philosophical reflection. Scripture serves all of these purposes. Therefore, we examine Scripture under philosophical reflection in Note 10 about the nature of the world, about time, about being, and about human community. Through the phenomenological method, therefore, biblical study takes place through the science of phenomenology, concerning the role of transcendence, concerning the constitution of the real. We will constitute the real through our engagement with Scripture and through the work of the transcendental depth of consciousness. We will constitute the real and posit the objectivity of the real through the work of the depth of consciousness in its dialectical relationship with Scripture, which will be taken as a phenomena revealing the role of transcendence. It has true transcendental content. So that becomes the concrete aim of phenomenology in Block 2. It is all about taking up the science of phenomenology in a dialectical engagement with Scripture, and through that dialectical engagement with Scripture, we will be, the consciousness will be excited by the givenness of Scripture. It will be excited by that input, and it will do the work of transcendental depth, true transcendental depth of consciousness, to form ideas and to constitute the real. And so we've got in Block 1 the theory that phenomenology is the best science for interpreting Scripture. In Block 2, we have the concrete 10 steps of how the aim of phenomenology will take place, how it will be realized, and it is summarized at the bottom of the chart in a 7-moment process. So if you look at the very bottom of the chart, here's your 7-moment summary. 1. We bracket the assumptions of naturalism. 2. We trace back the origin of the phenomena in Scripture. Then we engage in the work of consciousness to generate the objectivity of the real as a process of generation by the transcendental depth of consciousness. We do this by engaging with the givenness of textual Scripture, and then by reducing it to the original life world context within which it is presented, and then through the work of transcendental consciousness, we will form ideas or signs. Sign formation or idea formation will take place. And finally, 7, we will constitute the real, the objectively real. So it's bracketing, it's tracing back, it's process of generation, encountering the givenness of Scripture, it is reduction, and then it is transcendental formation of idea and constituting the objectively real. So in this mini first introductory lesson, it's just 20 pages, but we get a great little overview of phenomenology, its aim, and the concrete steps that will be taken up through the interpretation of Scripture in this volume. And that's going to wrap up the first essay, pages 1 through 20, Biblical Criticism and the Phenomenology of Scripture.